before we get going, I want to just ask a basic question. It's not on the screen or anything, but how does God speak to you? And if you could, give me some concrete examples of, like, you were in such and such a situation, and God clearly gave you direction, and this is how he did it. Please no generalities like the Bible or prayer. I mean a specific situation where you needed guidance, and God clearly spoke to you about what to do. What did that look like? Grace? So when you say Ecclesiastes gave you more information, more validation, you mean the part where it says meaningless, it's all meaningless? You know, I'm just joking. Okay. So you're saying that it started out for you as kind of like just a feeling in your heart that you knew something needed to change in a certain area, and then it went on to things that were affirming that and kind of teaching that and leading you in that. Okay. So it started off with like something inside. Okay. All right. Okay. Anybody else? So kind of like maybe an inner voice. Okay. Okay. Anybody else? Hey, go ahead. So hold on, Danny. Are you saying that you feel like your sister is how God? Right there. That's what I want to get at. How did you know it was God speaking to you? Okay, so actually I'm glad you brought this up, Danny, because this is a very important point that I think you hit on. I just want to clarify. You correct me if I'm not getting what you're saying. But it sounds like what you're saying, that there was a feeling that you had that you wanted this thing, and then a different kind of feeling that you knew was God, not you, that said, no, this isn't a good thing. Which is and that's what you're saying, right? It's a very good point that you brought up, because there's a difference between what I feel and what God feels. Remind me after service to tell you what I was about to tell you. Anybody else? Thank you for sharing that, Danny. Anybody else? How you knew God had spoken to you? Okay. I want to make sure we got that out. And so basically I have here in my notes, tell everybody they're all wrong. So you're all wrong. No, I'm just kidding. I'm joking. There was not something with a right or wrong answer, guys. It was just to get your guys' input. Oh, my goodness. So, okay, that is going to tie in with what we were looking at today. It doesn't fully answer that question. Well, you'll see what I'm getting at. So, just by way of recap, since it's been a couple weeks, last week, so it was 2 weeks ago. Last time we looked, we finished up verse 24, which basically we were talking about how the new covenant welcomes us in. There was that contrast between Mount Sinai and Mount Zion, and so now we're going to pick up in verse 25 and read through the end of chapter 12. Todd, would you mind reading it, please?
See to it that you do not refuse him who speaks. If they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, how much less will we if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, once more I will shake not only the earth but also the heavens. The words once more indicate the removing of what can be shaken, that is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire.
All right, so this is going to finish up chapter 12, and we'll finish with Hebrews by the end of the year, and in the next year we'll be going on to cults and the occult. But let's go ahead and look through here verse by verse. We'll start back on 25. It says, "See to it that you do not reject the one who speaks." So if we ask a question here of how is God speaking here in Hebrews 12, verse 25, where it says, "See to it that you do not reject the one who speaks." How is he speaking? Well, if you remember from 2 weeks ago, it was talking about the way that the blood of Abel was speaking a word of condemnation, right? But then the blood of Jesus was speaking a word of affirmation, a word of forgiveness, a word of mercy. So the first thing we can see here, how did God speak? I think that there's three things that we can look at the verses of Hebrews 12 and kind of get answers to. The first is his blood. God speaks to us through his blood. You know, a lot of times people ask, well, how do I know that Jesus is the right God? How do I know that, that God is speaking? How do I know that? His blood. His blood is speaking to us still. The door is still open to heaven, and his blood is speaking to us, calling out for us to come and be forgiven. The second thing that we see in Hebrews chapter 12 is the things previously mentioned. So like this would be like the Mount Zion pros, like pros and cons, the Mount Zion pros. And so if you remember, we talked about that 2 weeks ago where it was talking about the myriads of angels and Jesus and all those different things from that previous section where it was saying those things were at Mount Zion. All those things, those are ways that God is speaking to us. And if you look at these things, a lot of them are kind of, don't misunderstand what I'm saying, but kind of fantastical. They're not really things like we think typically of God speaking. We have, like, for instance, the myriads of angels that are rejoicing in heaven. This is God speaking to us. And even though we don't see myriads of angels, it's God's revelation still speaking to us. And then the third thing that we see from Hebrews chapter 12 is I really struggled with the way of saying this more clear, and I don't think there's a way that I could have said it. Somebody else probably could have said it more clear. I couldn't. Past words with future promises. So basically, God speaks to us now. Okay. So the words that God has given in the past speak to us now with promises to the future, if that kind of makes sense. So in other words, let me say it differently. God gave words before, and they didn't really have their full impact because Jesus hadn't come yet. But now that Jesus has come, those words that were spoken a long time ago now carry a present weight that gives us future hope. That kind of makes sense. So we see in chapter 12 these three areas that God is speaking to us. And these, once again, these aren't really ways that we typically think of, except maybe the third one, the past words, when we read the Bible. But yes, these are all the ways in chapter 12 that the writer says that God is speaking. So see to it that you do not reject the one who speaks, for if they did not escape when they rejected him who warned them on earth, even less will we if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven. So once again, who's the they here? Well, a lot of the problems that I see people handling this verse is they forget the previous paragraph. The they here is not talking about, the sinners of our nation today. It's talking about the Israelites, the ones who were at Mount Sinai, who God spoke and it terrified them. This is the very next paragraph. Like, let's not separate it hugely. For if they, the Israelites, did not escape when they rejected him in the wilderness at Mount Sinai. And then when it says, even less will we. So the idea here, and you'll remember this is something I've said all the way from the beginning of Hebrews back 15 years ago when we first started studying it, is the idea of there's the repeated theme of lesser to greater arguments. It's repeated all the way through Hebrews. Here we see it again. So the basic idea here is with a greater revelation, with a greater forgiveness, with a greater mercy, with a greater thing like Mount Zion, how much greater Mount Zion is to Mount Sinai, with that greatness, there is a negative side to that, and that is the harsher punishment. I'm going to unwrap this a little more in here in just a minute, but basically there's the idea that we live in an age now, an age of grace, okay? And when people talk about the Bible, they talk about it like this. The God of the Old Testament was harsh, but the God of the New Testament is loving, right? Don't you hear people say that all the time? Well, see, it's kind of a double-edged sword because in a way I see what they're saying, but don't forget that because of God's overabundance of love in this age, there's actually a harsher punishment for those who reject his love in this age than there was for his punishment in the last age. So it's kind of, like I said, it's kind of a double-edged sword, and that's where the lesser to greater argument comes in. Because yes, we do have a greater revelation, we do have something greater than Mount Sinai, but with that comes a harsher punishment. And I'll get to that in just a second. But it's basically, if you will, the idea that they didn't know any better. And what I mean by that is, they didn't have the full revelation, and we do. And so God punishes people according to what they know. So, for instance, the Israelites were punished, yes, for the revelation that they had at Mount Sinai. But here we have a harsher punishment. Even less will we, if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven. We have a greater thing at risk than they did. They didn't have as full of a revelation, so God didn't punish them as harshly. Now, once again, we look at the terror of Mount Sinai, and yeah, God punished them. How much more will the terror be for us if we reject in the age of grace and mercy and love? How much in the end will be the punishment? So there's a little bit of a, double-edged sword. I don't know how else to say it. So then verse 26 goes on to say, his voice shook the earth at that time, but now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. So the previous shaking that he's talking about, I know these verses can kind of seem a little bit confusing sometimes. Let me say what he's not talking about. He's not the shakings that he's talking about are not the bad things that came, like the Black Plague or years of famine and death and Israel losing their nation and all that. Those aren't the shakings that he's talking about. Those were very scary things. They were formative things. They were shaking things, absolutely. But in Hebrews, he's talking about 2 times of shaking. And the first shaking that he's talking about is Mount Sinai. When the law was given, it was met with terror and all that happened in the law with Moses. That's the first shaking. His voice shook the earth at that time, at the time of Moses. But now he has promised, yes, once more I will also shake. So there's 2 shakings that he's talking about. The first one is way back at Mount Sinai with Moses. But then the second shaking that he's talking about is one that is coming not only on earth, but also on heaven. And this is with the new heavens and the new earth. So this is going to be bigger and greater than Mount Sinai thing was. So once again, when we're looking at the earth, there are Earth's history. There are certain key parts that we highlight as this is a time of God's shaking. But in the book of Hebrews, it's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about all those things that are our key historical movement periods for us. For the author of Hebrews, there's 2 shakings: Mount Sinai and the coming new heaven and new earth. Okay, so just so we're all on the same page of what he's talking about, and with that comes the powers of the earth overthrown. Now, this is a quotation from Haggai chapter 2, verse 6, but it is slightly altered. Now, I'll read Haggai 2:6, and I'll read you the altered version so you can see what I'm saying. For the Lord of armies says this: once more in a little while I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. It ends there. Now, in this context of the Old Testament, when he talks about the heavens, he's probably talking about the skies, such as the stars falling out of the heavens. He's not actually talking about heaven, more than likely. But in Hebrews, when he quotes it, he's actually literally talking about heaven. His voice, and this is where he quotes it in verse 26, his voice shook the earth at that time, but now he has promised, and here's the Haggai quote, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. So that you can see how it's a little bit changed there. And just in case you didn't pick up what I was trying to emphasize, I'll clarify. The order has been changed. So here it's earth, but also the heavens, whereas in Haggai it was heavens and the earth. And the second thing that has been changed in Hebrews over Haggai is it says, I will shake not only, but also. And Haggai didn't say that. And the reason why he added these words and changed this around is because he's trying to draw attention and clarifying the contrast that's happening, okay? So basically, the latter will be a much bigger deal than the former was, okay? So let me say it differently, okay? He's trying to emphasize the point that yet one more time, I'm going to shake not just the earth like I did at Mount Sinai, but also the earth and the heavens with the new heavens and the new earth. So now we get to verse 27. It says, this expression, yet once more, indicates the removal of what can be shaken, that is, created things, so that what is not shaken might remain. So he's kind of just drawing out a point here for us. The whole idea that verse says, yet once more, is is trying to clue us into the fact that there's a final shaking happening. The first shaking was at Mount Sinai, and then there's going to be a final shaking. And with that final shaking, that is going to prevent it from ever happening again. Right now, things can be shaken. And we have a promise that it will be shaken one more time. But then after it has been shaken, by definition, that yet once more means it's not going to be shaken again. Kind of the end of the physical and temporary things. And I think once again with the floods, we kind of got a reminder of this, of the different things that will pass. We always talk about this too will pass when we're talking about pain and suffering, but I think that the flood showed us that it doesn't just apply to the bad things, it also applies to the good things. All of these things will pass. Good health or bad health, it'll pass. You having wealth or not having wealth, it'll pass. You having problems or not having problems, it'll pass. The sin that you're struggling with, it'll pass. All the blessings in your life, they'll pass, but also all the bad things will pass too. So that what is not shaken might remain. So that after all the physical and temporary things are shaken, you're left with what is not, which is the new heavens and the new earth, the resurrected body, all that. So then we get to verse 28, and it says, "Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful. By it we may serve God acceptably with reverence and awe." So let's read that again. I think that it's something important is being said here, and I don't want to skip past it. "Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken," because there's only going to be one more shaking, "let us be thankful." So we're not inheriting a temporary earthly power, which I did not plan for this to be during the elections, but here we are. "By it we may serve God acceptably with reverence and awe." So what he's saying here is the result of us knowing and us receiving this should be thankfulness and worship. The expected result of us receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken should be thankfulness, and that thankfulness should lead us to, with reverence and awe, worship. And verse 29 says, very short verse, "For our God is a consuming fire." Now this is actually a quote from Deuteronomy 4:24, which I think I wrote down. Yes, I did. Which says, "For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God." And if you go back and read Deuteronomy 4, especially these paragraphs around this verse here, there's a few things he's talking about. One thing he's talking about is the way that Moses is not going to be allowed in the promised land. Because he had messed up, and he says, okay, don't worship don't worship other gods and idols and all that stuff. And then he goes on to talk about how God is a jealous God and how he's a consuming fire. So in the context, how does it apply to Hebrews? Well, because the alternative, let me say it like this. Because if the Hebrew people abandoned Jesus and went back, first off, God would be jealous. That's the first thing. Second off, if God's great works inspire apathy from us, God will be jealous about that. Okay, and I have an example here I'll get to in just a minute. But the alternative to worshiping and being thankful is being worthy of punishment. And I know that it sounds like, worship me or else, but that's not really the idea here. The idea here is when God shows such great mercy and we meet it with indifference, kind of like, imagine if you will, and I know this is a gross under comparison, but maybe in putting it in such human terms will kind of connect better. You go to high school, and the girl that you like writes you a love letter, and she's all proud, and she hands it to you in person, and you throw it on the ground and spit in her face. It's kind of like that, except like way, way more intense, right? Because it's God, and he's not a girl, and this isn't high school. But you get what I'm saying. Like it's that essence of God does something so completely sacrificial, and then meeting that with not caring. So God is not just deserving, but also jealous for our worship and thankfulness. God is not apathetic towards our worship and thankfulness. It might seem like such a little thing to us, but to God, that's what he really wants. He wants that thankfulness from us. He wants that heartfelt appreciation and worship. Worship even when you don't feel like, even when you don't feel good, when you still worship, that means something to God. And obviously spiting God would not be wise. So his wrath is poured out, will be poured out, worse in the future. And I just really want to make sure we all get this, the idea that God is not, especially popular culture has this view of God that basically he's a pansy now. You know what I mean? Like he just kind of goes with the flow, willy-nilly. I love everybody, so nobody's going to get a spanking, that kind of stuff. And it's not really the image that we see in the Bible. And so people have this idea, well, God's a pansy now. He used to be harsh back then, and those days are gone. And when we read verses like this, it kind of warns us strongly that no. We are in an age of God's extreme grace and mercy, but lest we shun that, there is something worse waiting for us than they experienced at Mount Sinai. So, in another example here I'd written down, your wife makes you a wonderful meal and you fling it off the table. It's just kind of that spitting in the face kind of thing. So God does love. He absolutely does love. He is love. However, he is also God. And a lot of times, some of the biggest controversies and problems that people have with God is not understanding that God is not single attributive. And what I mean by that is, so God is not only love. He's love and also justice and forgiveness and wrath. He's not a single-dimensional character, if that kind of makes sense. For those of you who really get into literature, you're going to read a lot of books where some characters are just very flat, like they have no depth to them. How Adolf Hitler is typically portrayed is that he never did anything smart or wise or good. He only did things evil because he did a lot of evil things. Well, how much do you want to bet that there's some good things that Adolf Hitler did somewhere in there, I'm imagining. I mean, I haven't done a treatise on his life, but it seems pretty impossible for him to never have a good idea just because he committed genocide, doesn't it? I mean, everybody's had a good idea, no matter how evil they are. I mean, even Satan has had a couple good ideas, right? So with that being said, how much more we're talking about God, the God of the universe, the creator. He cannot be reduced down to one single thing of, well, God is love and only love, nothing but love. Well, that's not what the Bible says. It does say that God is love, but God has a lot more depth to him than that. And so if we're willing to admit that someone is evil, as Adolf Hitler may have had more depth to him than we often see him portrayed, how much more the good and perfect creator of the entire universe has depth to him over simply being love. And I know that might sound a little bit backwards, but I don't know how else to say that. So, two things I want to get to before we close off this section. Because you have to watch what you say, and people will kind of grab it and run wild with it, I'm not condoning Adolf Hitler, just so we're all on the same page. Okay? Don't want that coming back to haunt me in a few years on social media. I'm obviously not saying that I'm on his side or anything. I'm not crazy, okay? So anyways, two things I want to mention here. The first thing, and I think that this is something that still has a lesson for the church today, here, now. And that's this. What mountain are we calling people to? Think about this. In our witnessing, in our church services, what mountain are we calling people to? Are we calling people to the mountain of guilt and shame and terror, trying to badger them into accepting Jesus because they're sinners that are facing hell? Not that they aren't, but are we trying to lead them to Mount Sinai, a place of terror and doom, or are we trying to lead them to Mount Zion, a place of peace and mercy and love and grace? I think a lot of times in our witnessing, we try to lead the people to the wrong mountain. Another thing that I feel like sometimes we lead people to the wrong mountain is, and once again, I did not plan for us to be in this part of Hebrews in political season, but with politics, a lot of times churches have this idea that we're trying to gather people in to become whatever. On that side of the mountain, it was Democrats because they were more biblical, and on this side of the mountain it's Republicans because they're more biblical, and so everybody has an idea of what political party they need to be a part of, and I think that that's bringing people to the wrong mountain. You know what I mean? Actually, there was a pastor friend of mine that lost a family from his church because he didn't talk about politics enough from the stage. And his argument was basically my same argument. I'm here to preach Jesus and him crucified, not politics. Jesus is too big and too mighty to share his throne with anybody. And, evidently some people don't like that. And sometimes you got to be okay with losing people to stay on point of the message of Jesus Christ. It's hard, but, part of being a leader is accepting the hard things and keep going with what the church needs, not with what you personally want. And so we're not trying to call people to the mountain of politics or wealth and health. We're not trying to bring people to that mountain. We're trying to bring people to the mountain of Mount Zion, a place of peace, mercy, and grace, with the righteous and the angels and all those wonderful things that chapter 12 told us about, and a place of rejoicing and a place of God's presence. That's the place we're trying to bring them to, that mountain, not to Mount Sinai, not with all the shame and all that stuff. And the second thing I wanted to mention is when you're witnessing to people, inevitably it's going to happen, so just be prepared for it. People are going to bring up the thing about the Old Testament and God doesn't love people and all this different stuff. And they're going to, basically try to discredit the message of the gospel because of something that they know or think that they know from the Old Testament. And I think that this passage in Hebrews gives us a little bit of direction maybe for having more important, deeper conversations to move people from one mountain to another. In fact, when you're witnessing to people, if they bring up the thing about the Old Testament, you might want to draw attention to the two different mountains, Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. It's a good, and I'm not going to tell you exactly what that looks like, but if you pray and think about that and kind of study the Word, as the opportunity presents itself, I think that you'll probably have good direction all by yourself. But there's just something to keep in mind that we are not trying to get people to go back to the law. We're trying to get people to come to Mount Sinai and the blood of Christ, which just speaks a better word than Abel's blood. So, to summarize everything we looked at tonight, the welcome of the new covenant carries a warning with it. I don't know how else you could say that. Sometimes I'll sit there for days, not sit there like that's all I'm doing, but I'll spend days trying to figure out a better way to say something, and I'll just land on exactly what I said in the first place, and I'll just say, well, this is the best I can do, and you guys just have to take it for what it is. So any questions that we had with any of these verses here? Okay, next week we will start on chapter 13, and we'll finish up chapter 13 in December.